This is a story that's developing really quickly. Every day, every other day, there's a new development.
So it's exceedingly important that those who do want to reach people are on the platform where everyone is at.
This especially worries me because social media companies are so large that they're having to rely on algorithms.
Welcome to the Aussie Wire News. Now, in case you haven't heard yet, all of our interviews from ARC are now live in our Insiders area. That's our paid supporters area. They have access to every single interview that we did at ARC, including my 90-minute deep dive interview with former Deputy Prime Minister John Anderson. Now, in addition to all of that exclusive content that our insiders get, they also have a code to get my new book, Good People Break Bad Laws, for half price. So not only do our insiders help the Aussie Wire to keep bringing you news with a focus on truth, freedom and hope, but they're also getting giveaways and discounts, exclusive content, and much, much more. And if you're not an insider, well, you're missing out. So head to the link in the description to become an insider, support the Aussie Wire, get half-price copies of Good People Break Bad Laws in time for Christmas, and heaps of amazing exclusive content that is ready for you right now. Now, if you're not an insider, you can still get a discount on this book with the code TAW, that's T-A-W, order now so that you get your copy in time for Christmas. Order at goodpeoplebreakbadlaws.com. Now, without further ado, here's today's news. Well, over last weekend, we saw the mother of all revelations, M-O-A-R. I can't suggest that you Google it for various technical legal reasons, but if you were to Google M-O-A-R and watch a video on Rumble, you'd learn some interesting things that happened last week that some people don't want you to know about. Here to not have a conversation about the things that we're not allowed to see and we're certainly not allowed to talk about is our regular contributor, Rebekah Barnett. Rebekah, this is going to be a tricky story to cover.
Well, yeah, it's just conspiracy theories as far as the eye can see.
Well, yeah, but on the one hand, we've got the government saying it's a bunch of conspiracy theorists, and on the other hand, we're watching a conspiracy of big tech and governments play out before our very eyes to silence this issue.
Yeah, so we'll just catch people up. This is a story that's developing really quickly. Every day, every other day, there's a new development. So at the time of recording, where we're at is we're talking about New Zealand, and we're talking about a data dump where a whistleblower came forward and said, I work in the health system. He works on a pay-per-dose scheme. So administrative data.
He claims to be the Oracle administrator overseeing the database and the record keeping of essentially every single dose and the health outcomes for every one of those people.
Yes, but only for the pay-per-dose program. So that doesn't actually...
That's true. It's not the entire database.
Given.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. So just one group of vaccinations given, but it appears that the data is the entirety of the data from that system, which is a portion of the vaccinations given within New Zealand. So he's come forward and said, I've got this data and it shows that the vaccines that they... Particularly, there was a claim that there were where there were clusters of associated with particular batches. So that was released last week in this video that was quite lengthy. And to be honest, I personally felt that the release was quite botched. It was a bit confusing. The video goes for a long time. You got to wait for 15 minutes before we really even get to what the news is, and it's overly kind of emotional. And they show some data on a screen, but you don't really have any verification of it along with that release. However, subsequently, Steve Kirsch, who's a famous American, I think he would call himself an anti-vaxxer, actually. He's famously COVID vaccine skeptical. He then did a presentation at MIT. He released the data de-identified, so not exposing anyone's personal private information at all. He then released that data so that everyone could download it, have a look at it, figure out, is it legit, is it not? This all created quite a bit of confusion because unfortunately this verification process was happening within the week after the revelation was dropped. Ideally, I think you would want that to happen before you do the drop, because then people were questioning, is the data fake? Can we trust it? Where are all the rest of the vaccinations that were given? Is the data set biased? Is it just showing more deaths because it was just showing the records of old people? Correct. So there's been a lot of confusion, and then that's kind of all been, I mean, the great thing about alternative media at the moment, particularly the Substack platform and particularly Twitter, is that these conversations are happening out in the open, so we can follow along. It's very different. It's more like the democratization of the process, rather than what our governments tend to do, which is let us sit on it for 5 years and think about whether we'll let you know. So in that sense, it's actually been really positive, but it was, I feel, sloppy in the way that it was communicated, because a lot of those what about this, what about this, could have been answered in the initial release.
And they weren't. Can I say, though, Rebekah, I feel as though, oftentimes the cover-up is the crime. It's, there's the crime itself, and then there's the cover-up, and the cover-up is often the worst part of the crime. And in a sense, the New Zealand government's efforts to stop everyone from talking about this and trying to stop anyone from having a copy of this data, to me, is one of the strongest confirmations of its accuracy that you could ask for.
Yeah, I mean, it is a story in and of itself how the government has responded. So within the week, or within days really of the revelation, the police turned up at this whistleblower's house. He's been arrested and charged. They've got news stories running in all the media in New Zealand saying there's been a data breach. Conspiracy theorists have gone wild with this information. And, they're going to great pains to use words like misinformation, conspiracy theorists, to tell you that this whistleblower is not a vaccine expert. Well, he never said he was. He's a data administrator. He appears to be exactly what he said he was the whole time. So, they haven't refuted that the data is what he said it is, which I find really interesting, because I think that's quite telling, that they haven't said, oh, it's not what he said it is. What they've said is it's been interpreted wrong. Okay. But actually, they haven't refuted any of the points made. They've just used the word misinformation, used the word conspiracy theorist, broad brush.
And they must be aware of the Streisand effect. The effort to get something removed from the internet is only going to amplify it. And so you would think, if they're sitting there going, well, the data is accurate data from the New Zealand government, but it's been misinterpreted, surely that would spur them to then say, well, here's the rest of the data, and this is the picture that unfolds once you interpret the whole volume of data correctly. They've gone completely the other way.
So they've gone full 1984, and they've put an injunction. They've got an injunction, and
hence we can't show you certain things from that data dump and various graphics and things like that.
We're playing it safe. Because there is an injunction, and they reportedly do have cybersecurity experts trawling the internet, issuing takedown notices.
Certainly
now,
YouTube, etc.
If there is a concern over people's private data being leaked, but that's not what we're talking about. It's been de-identified. And it's a good question. Why can't the citizens of the world see what's happening on a location basis or on a dose by dose basis, or why aren't we allowed to see de-identified data showing us how effective or how safe these vaccines are? It's publicly owned data. Why aren't we allowed to see it?
Taxpayers paid for the data collection and administration. They paid for the actual vaccines and the medical program in the first place. Taxpayers own that information. It's quite extraordinary to me that the government presumes that it has the right to say, no, you people who paid for this, you can't see this. Now, there have been some qualified people that have seen it, though, and they've come up, and some people have disputed various things. Like you said, there's a wonderful conversation happening out in the public view, which I think is exactly where it needs to be. But I'd like to bring up this one that you drew my attention to. Now, this is Norman Fenton. He's no idiot. And he says, the New Zealand data confirms what we saw in the most recent ONS data. There is now no doubt that the vaccine is increasing the mortality rate in older people. Now, this is the conclusion that he's come to based on the data that we're not allowed to see. Do you think this is going to have much of an impact in the overall conversation? Is this going to move the needle, or is the New Zealand government just going to try and suppress it and move on like it never happened?
Yeah, I mean, to me, this comes back to the botched release, because I think for maximum impact, this should have been released via mainstream media, because the only people who have really seen the claims are the people who follow alternative media already. Sure. What the layperson in New Zealand will be seeing is that there was a data breach and it was a dirty anti-vaxxer who did it.
Yeah.
That's all they're getting.
Yeah.
And when they do Google it, if they do Google it, what they'll find on Rumble is a fairly hyper sensationalized, overly emotional, waffly video that's really unclear with what it's trying to say and doesn't look particularly credible. So that's unfortunate, I think. But yeah, I mean, Norman Fenton, I am inclined to trust. He's a highly respected Bayesian analyst, or he has skills in that area. And, you know, he's said that if this data set is real and if it's unbiased and if it's representative, then it's very important. He has questioned the claims about he's got concerns over the fact that there are other variables which could be confounding. Sure. For example, the age of the people sampled in those apparent. But you know, on balance across the board, his take is that it shows that the vaccines aren't doing anything to B, that they're just so. I think, you know, we should watch this space. There'll be more analysis in the days to come. But it looks like the truth is, you know, somewhere, it looks like the main takeaways are probably this data set is real and probably it shows that these vaccines aren't helping and they're probably actually not sure about the claims, seems to be a bit confounded. And then the other main takeaway being the government's response and their reticence to let New Zealanders see their own publicly owned data.
Yeah. As I've said for years in any of these things, it's not until you see the numbers behind the numbers that you can really begin to evaluate the strength of the claims. I share some skepticism around these. For those that are not sure what we're talking about here, this is the suggestion that there were specific batches of vaccines that had radically higher adverse events than others. But of course, if a batch is fairly small and it's very early in the rollout and it's given to the most vulnerable people, let's say people who are already in nursing homes, then you would expect to see a high mortality rate over 2.5 years for those people in the first place.
Yeah, and just to say, things not, even if it's questionable in this data set, there are batches in you know, various pharmacovigilance systems like theirs and in ours, the DN, that are associated with a higher number of and serious. So given the known production issues, particularly with the mRNAs where you know, they transferred from a high integrity kind of, let's say, small batch method into this kind of mass scale method, which has led to the alleged contamination in the DNA contamination in the mRNA vaccines as well. You know, there has been variability detected in the batches, particularly with mRNA integrity, but and that came through the EMA documents that were data leaked, I believe, showed variations in the mRNA integrity, but we've also got variations in the amount of DNA contamination as well. Sure. So it's not unlikely that there are bad batches, and there's that website, How Bad Is My Batch, where you can go and have a look and see which batches are associated with really high rates of reporting. It's just a question of whether this particular data set can, you know, unequivocally prove that or not. And that's the question mark.
Yeah. Look, it's always better to be more cautious, I think, in interpreting these things rather than sensationalist and overblown. Yeah. As you said at the very outset, this is a story that is developing very quickly. We have an arrested whistleblower now in New Zealand. We have the New Zealand government colluding with big tech to try and suppress information that is in my opinion, very much in the public interest. And of course, what you should definitely not do if you're not sure about this story is go to Rumble and look for Mother of All Revelations and watch a video.
Or go to Norman Fenton's Substack, which is called Where Are the Numbers, and have a look at his analysis.
Yeah, definitely don't do that, because that would potentially put you in breach of the New Zealand government's suppression order on this information. Rebekah Barnett, it's always a pleasure. We will, of course, stay across this story. Thank you for all the work you do.
Thanks.
Well, no doubt you, like me, have noticed this trend for, shall we say, role swapping. Call it maybe blackwashing, although maybe that's an expression that's going to get me into trouble. Have you noticed that Netflix and Disney seem to, well, they've gone beyond being colourblind, haven't they? It's sort of all about the colour these days. I've certainly noticed that, and here on the Aussie Wire we talk about pop culture, maybe more than we should, but honestly it is important. People do use music and movies and entertainment of all varieties to try and influence culture. Now that's not an inherently bad thing, but it is something we ought to be aware of. And I wanted to bring on an expert, and who could be more of an expert in culture than a TikToker? Yes, that's right, we're going there. We're bringing on a TikToker to discuss the culture wars with us right now, and it is none other than Dennis Fang. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Aussie Wire, Dennis.
Hello, thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Now, I genuinely could not think of anyone better qualified to discuss pop culture than someone who has gone big on TikTok, as you have done, because that is obviously, you've got to have your finger on the pulse of what's going on in the culture and what people are resonating with and connecting with to be able to talk about this. But I've gone through your TikToks, and you do spend quite a lot of time covering issues around sort of the replacing of historically, let's say, white or Eastern European or various other ethnic groups with overwhelmingly, African or African American extraction people. This is an example here of something that you've covered in one of your TikToks, Denzel Washington to play Hannibal. Why does this bother you? Why is this something that you devote so much time to in your TikToks?
Well, it's simply because I value the truth so much. And these people who are trying to propagate this message that history, especially non-Black history, was full of especially African Americans, is absolutely absurd. And there's been very little backlash against this in mainstream media. And surely I decided there must be some kind of thirst on the internet for some truth in this. And I decided to speak out against it.
Well, it's an incredibly time-consuming thing that you do, because in contrast to most TikTokers, and most TikTokers I frankly would never invite on the show, but when I had a look at your work, you do put an enormous amount of research into what you do. You're not just there spouting an opinion, you've researched this. That's an enormous investment of time. Why have you gone and said, well, I want to change the world, I want to make the world a better place, I'm committed to truth, I'll get on TikTok and invest huge amounts of time into TikTok videos? That's a very specific medium, don't you think?
Yes, TikTok is quite a specific medium, but it's also the place where most people, especially young people these days, get all the information from. So it's exceedingly important that those who do want to reach people are on the platform where everyone is at. And as for speaking about history, well, history is extremely important because it's how we understand the world. It's how we understand truth. It's how we understand who we are as people, where we came from. It's one of the most important topics that I believe is out there, and sadly most people don't know enough about it. And therefore I've decided to use my platform to educate people on the truth, rather than popular messages that make certain groups merely feel good.
Another recent TikTok of yours focused on this historical controversy, which clearly has there's a lot of noise and fury over. I've frankly never even heard of this guy. I'm not a big student of history. I'm more modern history than ancient. And you've dedicated a TikTok to addressing this question of whether this particular little-known or relatively little-known Roman emperor was actually trans. But at the last part of this headline here, and does it really matter? I guess my question for you is, why are people trying to make others believe that this person was trans? Or why are they trying to make us believe that Hannibal was black? What's actually at work here?
Well, ultimately, we do like to believe that history is about finding truth. It's about uncovering what really happened. But quite sadly, throughout all of history, it appears that history has mostly been used, especially popular history, been used to legitimize the current status quo. So history legitimizes who we are as people, the current systems at work. So even if we look at ancient Rome, they rewrote their own history to insert themselves into the Greek world, into the Trojan War. That's what the Aeneas was. But it's very obvious that Romans had nothing to do with the Trojan War, but they inserted themselves because they were now part of this wider narrative. If we look later at nationalism during the 19th century. Like, for example, the creation of Germany, the German identity. Where did that come from? They picked out little bits of history from the from Tacitus, a Roman historian, talking about some German tribes. And that obviously has very, very little to do with genuine modern German people, but it creates a narrative. It shows that they've been there all this time. And what's the current narrative? What's the current zeitgeist? The current zeitgeist is pretty much LGBT people have been around since time immemorial.
Sure.
And therefore, they're going back in history and they're trying to find anything to show that there has been trans people all over the place. And sadly, it appears that there really hasn't been that much because they've chosen Elagabalus, one of the worst Roman emperors there's ever been. He was just a debauched teenager who was a bit of a megalomaniac. I mean, he tried to make his own religion, and he was deeply unpopular. And it really boggles the mind they chose to use him. It really shows they are scraping the bottom of the barrel.
So, Dennis, I have to ask, because you've just answered that question off the top of your head with such a depth of historical knowledge. What is your background? Did you study history? What's brought you to the point where you know that much about these sorts of topics?
Unfortunately, I'm not a professor in history, but I did study media. So that's my background as a journalist. And I just have a tremendous interest in history since I was very young.
Well,
And therefore, I've decided to combine the two. And I think being a journalist with a strong historical knowledge has allowed me to carve my own little niche and has allowed me to see topical issues affecting the world today through a longer lens, which is something that I find quite troubling with most people because they don't have the historical knowledge to put things in context.
Well, it's impressive is what it is. Now, I just want to draw your attention to an upcoming remake here. We've got on the top of this picture here, we've got the Redhead Festival in Dublin, Ireland, which is obviously an annual gathering for redheads. And in the bottom half of that picture, we have the upcoming Disney remake of that event. Obviously, that's a joke meme, but this concept has made its way into popular culture in so many different forms. It's so obvious what Netflix and Disney are doing. Do you think there's light at the end of the tunnel? Do you think, I mean, Disney's getting smashed at the box office at the moment. They're losing money hand over fist. Do you think that economic realities are going to change this anytime soon, or are they really committed to just carrying this forward?
I think they do want to carry this forwards, but the reality is, if they do, they will lose a tremendous amount of money, as we are seeing right now. All the Disney remakes, particularly Little Mermaid, they were absolute bombs, which does show that although there is a demographic of people who do want this, it appears that most people simply see past this, which does show that perhaps there will be some kind of turn. But at the same time, from my experience, when most companies try to appeal to younger people, what they're usually recommended is, what young people are into are LGBT issues. They're into diversity, which is the whole reason we saw the Bud Light controversy.
Sure.
What they were recommended by was advice from a young person who has their own ideas of what young people want, and it appears that it's not what everyone wants, and perhaps this advice would change.
Well, hopefully we're going to see a return to sanity sometime soon. In the meantime, Dennis Fang, please just keep up that great work calling it out. I don't follow a single TikToker in the entire world right now, but you might very well have convinced me to change that. You might become my first follow on TikTok. We'll see. But in the meantime, Dennis, thank you so much for coming on the Aussie Wire.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, in the last few weeks, we've been covering here at the Aussie Wire some of what's happening back in the motherland, back in the United Kingdom. And there's some crazy stuff going on. I wanted to touch base with someone on the issue of academic freedom, and in particular, universities. We know that here in Australia, the experiences of people like Dr. Peter Ridd would cast doubt on the idea that there is academic freedom. We watch what's happening in the US, where massive student protests take place when a speaker is invited to speak. So much for universities being the home of ideas and the battle of ideas. Those days seem to be long gone. But are they suffering the same problems in the United Kingdom, the home of freedom, at least as it relates to Australia in the modern era? Well, to find out, I've invited on Ella Nixon. Ella, thank you so much for joining us here at the Aussie Wire.
Hello, thank you for having me.
It used to be taken for granted that universities were the place, even if nowhere else would, they were the place where robust conversations were had, disagreements were had, great minds could thrash out ideas and uncover the truth via whatever means necessary almost. They could sometimes be very brutal debates that would go on in universities. It seems that the same disease that has infected Australian and US universities may have infected universities in the UK as well. What is it actually like over there? What is the academic situation over there?
I think the tide has been turning a lot more in recent times. So there was a period where I'd say freedom of speech was especially restricted with what speakers were invited and lots of protests going on. But now there's been quite a bit of pushback. So there's been societies that have been funded by the Free Speech Union through a fund called the McTaggart Fund, and they've been established and they're hosting speakers from, a wide political spectrum, not just people who are just on the would be classed as right wing or left wing, but all over the spectrum, political spectrum, to push back against what kind of speakers can be hosted at universities and kind of cultivate this environment of free speech.
Well, this is an article here that is an example of one of those activist protests that you mentioned there. This was a gender-critical speaker. I think the fashionable term these days is a trans-exclusionary radical feminist. They seem to, new words get made up all the time. I'm still not quite sure what that one means. But it just seems as though we've entered an age, and I'm encouraged to hear that maybe the UK is coming out of it. I'll explore that more in a moment. But we're either in or we've just passed through an age of remarkable intolerance in what we're allowed to say. And I find it really curious that free speech has been framed as a right-wing idea, as a right-wing ideal. Historically, the left wing have been very committed to the idea of free speech, freedom of expression. I can say what I want, man. Let me live my life. What happened? What changed there?
I think free speech is always the tool of the minority for the people whose opinion, are thought to be morally bad. So I think at the moment, people on the left wing have more of a moral case for their free speech. It's in the culture of care. Words can incite hatred. So I think at the moment, people who are maybe more conservative get branded with their, this kind of moral blight, and that's why their freedom of speech is being belittled.
So you mentioned to me as we were chatting before we began recording that actually there's been some legislation passed in the UK. Tell me a little bit about what that legislation actually is designed to do.
So the freedom of speech clause for the universities is just designed to protect the right of universities to host different speakers, so they can't be cancelled based on their political views. And this was especially brought to light with the platforming of Jordan Peterson at Cambridge after he was cancelled from his speeches at I think it was at the Union. And then he was re-invited back as a speaker who, some people didn't agree with what he said, but that didn't matter because it's a university and a university should host speakers of all opinions.
It's quite an extraordinary thing. I mean, Jordan Peterson to me doesn't seem like all that radical of a thinker or a speaker. He just speaks fairly plainly and states what in many cases are very, very obvious truths. We've come to a stage where people are incredibly sensitive. And you mentioned a moment ago this idea that words are violence. This is quite a novel concept. Now, personally, I've never been punched in the pronoun, but it seems like some people feel like the words are literal violence. How do we come back from this sensitivity to try and recultivate a culture where we can have heavy conversations and not always be taking it personally?
I think we need to learn by example because it's very easy to complain, but we need to start to create the content which shifts the conversation. And for people who accuse free speech of saying it's only for like an extreme right-wing position, we need to actually prove, it's for people of all different persuasions and to just change those stereotypes.
You mentioned the legislation that guaranteed a certain amount of freedom for universities and what they did. Here in Australia, we're fighting for the second time in 10 years. We defeated it 10 years ago and it's come back in a different form. A bill that is trying to create a power for the government to use social media companies to punish people who say things that they don't like. And in particular, the government is threatening to punish social media companies if they leave content on their platform that breaches certain rules. What does it say about where we're at that the government is now looking to private companies and social media companies especially to try and bring about some sort of restrictions on free speech?
This especially worries me because social media companies are so large that they cannot be completely run by humans. You know, to censor speech is such a big task, so they're having to rely on algorithms. So actually, our freedom of speech is not just being censored by individuals who might have a personal problem with us, but actually by large digital corporations. And what does that say about the power of the individual human in society?
I beg your pardon. Sorry about that. No, this is a great point, and we're up against it in that regard. But I'm very, very encouraged to hear that actually the United Kingdom has had the good sense to protect universities, and hopefully some of that common sense will start to spread. Well, Ellie, you and I are both are committed to this, creating the new content that you talked about there, where we start to cross this bridge and start to have everyone simultaneously accept that free speech is vital to our progress. I commend your good work, and thank you so much for coming on the Aussie Wire.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for watching the Aussie Wire News. We release new episodes every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. You can catch up on past episodes at theaussiewire.com and be sure to join our email list while you're there. And finally, if you'd like a half-price copy of my book, Good People Break Bad Laws, just head to the link in the description to become an insider. And in there, you'll find a half-price code in the insiders area once you've joined. And if you're not an insider, you can still get a discount on the book by using the code TAW, T-A-W, when you order at goodpeoplebreakbadlaws.com. And if you order now, you'll get a signed copy in time for Christmas. I'm Topher Field, and thank you so much for watching the Aussie Wire.